You're listening to the Diplomats podcast on Asian geopolitics. As always, I'm your host from New York City, Ankit Panda, and I'm happy to be joined today by a longtime regular contributor to the Diplomat and a familiar figure to some of you that have been listening to this podcast for a while. I'm joined by Dr. Robert Farley. How's it going today, Rob?
It is. It's going very well today. The weather in central Pennsylvania is actually, it's cold, but it's sunny, so it's quite lovely.
Yeah, so, I'd gotten used to you being a main-time fixture for us in Kentucky, but now you find yourself in Pennsylvania. So do you want to just tell all our listeners what you're exactly up to in Pennsylvania these days?
Yes, well, I still regard myself as the Diplomat's chief Kentucky correspondent, but I've also taken on a new hat. So I am this year a visiting professor at the United States Army War College in the DNSS department, and I teach courses here to colonels and lieutenant colonels from 80 different countries, most notably the United States, but also a variety of others. And part of the professional military education system here in the United States, and it's really been quite eye-opening, a fascinating experience.
That's great. So what's the majority of your coursework focusing on right now? Military strategy or international affairs more broadly?
So the first course I taught was called Theories of War and Strategy.
Okay.
And here at the Army War College, we teach sequentially. So essentially, you teach an entire course, and then you move on to the next one. And Theories of War and Strategy was great thinkers down to contemporary thinkers on grand strategy. So we read Thucydides, Clausewitz, Sunza, and a bunch of others, Mahan. And the current course that I'm teaching is called National Security Policy and Strategy. And it's a little bit similar to some courses I taught at the University of Kentucky, but it's more sophisticated in a lot of ways. And we're doing a deep dive into the international environment, American procedures and processes for developing national values and national interests.
Okay.
It's really very interesting.
Very cool. Well, so I'm really glad to have you on the show today because the both of us have been tweeting and writing and blogging over the past few days about the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, which had come up in the Asia hand context for a bit, but really kind of on the periphery of the Asia debate, and now it's kind of been thrust into the forefront because the Trump administration, a few days ago, President Trump announced that he would withdraw the United States from INF, and this appears to be sort of a brainchild of John Bolton, his national security advisor, who's famously known for despising arms control arrangements more broadly. So for listeners that aren't familiar with the INF Treaty, it was signed in 1987 between Gorbachev and Reagan, and it was sort of a landmark of Cold War arms control, and it required both countries to not deploy, possess, or test ground-launched cruise and ballistic missiles with ranges between 500 kilometers and 5,500 kilometers. So that allowed both countries to retain onto their strategic missiles, the ICBMs, that have ranges in excess of 5,500 kilometers, and the shorter range systems below 500. But everything in the intermediate range category, so that included the Pershing and the ground-launched cruise missiles that the United States had in Western Europe, all of that was dismantled and destroyed, and this applied indefinitely all over the world. And the conversation that's erupted in the past few days has been really interesting because there's really three groups of people that have been talking about INF. You have sort of the European transatlantic security hands that have been talking about the effect on European security, the failure to consult European allies. You've had the Asia hands, and I think Rob and I are sort of part of this group who've been debating among themselves the options and benefits that open up for the United States now that its hands won't be tied, so to speak, by the INF restrictions. And one of the concerns here has been that China, formerly the People's Liberation Army's 2nd Artillery Corps, now the Rocket Force, possesses a ballistic and cruise missile arsenal where 95% of the inventory comprises of systems in that INF range prescribed limit. So China has a bunch of medium-range systems, intermediate-range systems, the DF-26, the DF-16, the DF-21, and its variant, including the DF-21D, all that fall in this INF prescribed range. And a lot of this has left the United States sort of feeling like there is a serious asymmetry there in capabilities. And the third set of people that have been talking about INF are the arms control analysts. And obviously, these groups have sort of varying perspectives. I think broadly it's fair to say that everybody agrees that the failure to consult allies was not a great call. But the broader debate I think that's now shaping up is, in my view, are the benefits that come from INF withdrawal simply more in tune with 21st century realities and where we find ourselves in now in 2018 with China, particularly as competition appears to be the word of the day when it comes to the U.S.-China relationship. So, Rob, I know that I'm going to spoil things for our listeners here a bit and suggest that I think you and I have sort of differing perspectives on this. So I'm hoping that we'll have a nice debate. So why don't I let you sort of make the more, I guess, I don't want to call you a pro-INF withdrawal person. I don't want to put words in your mouth. But, you seem to be a lot more sympathetic to the idea that the options that now open up for the United States are a good thing.
Yeah, well, I mean, first let me premise, and this goes back to the first part of the conversation, that nothing I'm about to say is everything I'm about to say is a personal view, and it's not necessarily shared by the Department of the Army War College, the Department of Defense, the U.S. government, University of Kentucky, or anyone else who might employ me at any time now or in the future.
Okay, we can put a note in the podcast notes about that, so that will be straight up front.
Right. So yeah, no, I mean, I think it's fair to characterize me, and I'm a newcomer, and I think I'm sort of idiosyncratic within the pro-INF withdrawal crowd, because normally I find myself quite comfortably within the arms control group of people. I'm not really the transatlanticist, but yeah, I mean, for me, sort of looking at this issue in more depth, which I've done, there's been a lot of literature on this. From some really smart people. And the more that I read about it, the more I sort of really came to the conclusion that the INF, while being sort of an extraordinarily important component of the peaceful drawdown of the Cold War in Europe, was also an arms control agreement that was so contextual to the late Cold War that it's very difficult to continue to usefully apply it in a situation in which there were technological changes and there were fundamental structural changes to international society. And in particular, what I'm thinking about here is the sort of the rise in the importance of China's conventional military. So this was a treaty which was supposed to constrain both the United States and Russia, but constraining Russia is no longer nearly as big of a deal as constraining China, right? China's ability, its latent and actual military power, is substantially greater than that of Russia. And so it's effectively you have a treaty that's prohibiting systems that does not prohibit one of the two largest military powers in the world from building missiles, right? It only prohibits one of those countries from building missiles.
So the one thing that I left out at the introduction was that in recent years, since 2014, the Obama administration made clear that Russia was violating INF. That's really important context here, and I should have mentioned that. So Russia has developed a missile known as the SSC-8. The NATO designator for that is actually pretty great. They call it the Screwdriver, which I think is really fitting for that missile. It's essentially an extended range version on land of the 3M14 caliber cruise missile that Russia used to strike targets in China and the like. Probably has a range of around 2,000 kilometers. But yeah, so Rob, to just respond to you briefly, I think what you said is absolutely right. But I think the observation that, for me, it's a bit of an obvious kind of observation that the options that open up for the United States are apparent in the wake of the collapse of INF. I think what I've noticed in just the past few days, just talking to people, proponents, opponents, hardcore arms control types about this issue, is there is really a gap in how these three groups are talking to each other. The Asia hands are not too interested in the transatlantic effects and the effects in Western Europe. So from the European perspective, the challenge looks quite different, is that the Chinese conventional challenge doesn't loom as largely over European states. But obviously in the United States, this has been a debate that's been going on since the era of the rebalance. You had the Andrew Krepinevich monograph on archipelagic defense, which saw a role for potential U.S. cruise missiles. I think we should be clear about what most of the INF withdrawal proponents really talk about. And Rob, maybe here you can also specify if you fall into this category. But what I'm really hearing is people want a fairly modest capability to be explored as part of the U.S. arsenal in the Pacific, which is cruise missiles specifically. Ballistic missiles might prove to be a little bit too destabilizing given the promptness with which they can strike Chinese targets. So people want cruise missiles with conventional payloads explicitly. I haven't really been hearing anybody talking about, a Pershing 3 kind of deployment on Okinawa or anything like that. But that's broadly the capability that I understand most people are looking for. Is that accurate?
Yeah, no, I think that's I mean, that's fundamentally what people are looking for. There is some interesting work. So yeah, what I want, what I think the United States should be able to develop and should be able to deploy are ground-launched cruise missiles with conventional warheads that are broadly similar to the sort of ground-launched cruise missiles that the Chinese can deploy right now, right? And these can be deployed in ways that offer a lot of different options for the United States down the road in terms of, as you suggest, archipelagic defense, um, but a variety of ways of striking targets in China, but not necessarily even targets in China, right? Also, targets that are at sea or targets that are in the South China Sea. And I understand there are basing issues. I appreciate that. Um, but yeah, no, ground-launched cruise missiles with conventional warheads is fundamentally what I'm interested in here.
Got it. So I'm glad you brought up the basing issues because that I've found to be one of the arguments that I've yet to hear a convincing proponent case for. In particular, I think the territories that I've most commonly heard associated with potential INF range deployments in Asia are Japan, specifically Japanese territories along the first island chain, so most prominently Okinawa, but potentially other island land masses in the area. You also hear Northern Australia, although I think that has a bit of a problem in that it actually gets you further away from the targets you'd want to hold at risk than Guam would, and Guam's U.S. territory, so you don't have to deal with sort of allied management issues there. You also hear about the Philippines potentially, and the Japanese, the main islands of Japan also do come up. In all of these cases, I think there are serious domestic political constraints where I just can't imagine. I think Japan is probably where you'd have the best chance to find a willing domestic constituency willing to stand up for American ground-launched cruise missile deployments. The Philippines, I think something would have to change quite dramatically in the country's domestic politics and its relationship with China. And Australia, too. I think Australia is maybe a little bit more of a complicated case. There is a pretty nuanced debate going on there about the role of its relationship with China and the United States. It's a U.S. ally, but again, I think the basing problem is actually quite serious. The only place that you end up that's a sure thing is Guam. But when you're talking about Guam, you already have a bomber presence there. You have B-1s that can deliver standoff air-launched cruise missiles, JASSMs, JASSM-ER, to hold many of these same targets at risk. You have naval capabilities, although I think the costs to deploy those could be considerably higher. One of the things I've heard, and I don't know what your thoughts on this are having some kind of, cruise missile units based at Guam that can be forward deployed either in a crisis or on sort of reassurance tours. Very much like fighters might be forward based. I don't know if that would be something that kind of bridges this deployment gap. I'm still a little skeptical, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Right. I mean, I hadn't heard the forward deployed, although I think that it makes great sense. Um, Even if it's only Guam, right? And even though Guam is really small, and Guam can't reach, even the longest range, although we'll see. One of the things the INF did, and so a common criticism from the pro INF people is that the United States doesn't have a lot of ready-made systems that it can deploy, sort of right off the bat, right when we're withdrawing from the system, which I think sort of fundamentally misunderstands how procurement and development in the United States happens. That services just don't invest in capabilities and they don't push for capabilities that they think are going to be canceled anyway because of running into international law. I think there are other existing systems that can be modified in ways. So, the Army's PRISM precision strike missile came to 499 kilometers, right? Well, there's nothing special about 499 kilometers, so that sort of system can be changed. But let's say that it's just sort of the classic LICM, the classic Tomahawk missile, and it's just Guam, and we just have road mobile missiles in Guam. That can't hold very much of China. In fact, I think it can only hold really a residue of China vulnerable, but it can contribute to sea control throughout the East China Sea, South Pacific. And ground-launched cruise missiles, especially if they're road-launched cruise missiles, are different than bombers insofar, and I think Kingston Reich made the point, oh, well, the Chinese already target Guam, every inch of Guam with their own ballistic missiles. That's true, but that's much more of a problem for the U.S. bomber forces than it would be for a road mobile GLICM system. Right? Guam is small, 210 square miles, but you can still hide road mobile cruise missiles in lots of places, even on a pretty small island. And whereas the Chinese could be almost assured of destroying air facilities in Guam by hitting Guam with lots and lots of conventional ballistic missiles, I think they would be much less assured of destroying the entirety of a ground-launched cruise missile system, especially if they were dispersed around the island, and especially if they're mobile.
Mm-hmm.
So one is that I think Guam's enough. Right. So I think Guam alone is enough, but the restrictions, diplomatic and political restrictions, that make it difficult to envision deploying these systems in places like Japan and places like the Philippines, I think are a lot more plastic than people are willing to acknowledge. The Japanese willingness to host these kinds of systems is based pretty fundamentally on Japan's concern about China. Right, the more concerned Japan is about China's behavior, the more willing they are going to be to allow these kinds of systems to be stationed in militarily relevant places on their territory. And so, in some sense, that's sort of folded into the system. The more threatening that China acts, the more we'll need GLICMs, and the more willing that Japan will be to allow us to deploy GLICMs.
Mm-hmm.
The same story with the Philippines. Right now, U.S.-Philippine relations aren't awesome, and Chinese-Philippine relations are much better. But that wasn't the case 10 years ago, and there's absolutely no indication or no guarantee that it'll be the case in 5 or 10 years from now. But if we have the ability to then move GLICMs to a now friendly Philippine government, one that is concerned about China, it would be great to have that capability rather than not be able to have it at all.
That's right. I mean, yeah, so those arguments, about the plasticity of sort of domestic political conditions in these countries, I think that's well taken. The other issue, that comes up from time to time in the INF debate, and at least had come up in around 2015, 2016, when we were debating, the archipelagic defense concept altogether, was to enable Japan to develop an indigenous capability, right? The debate about constitutional reform and Japan potentially pursuing its own offensive systems. None of that is restricted by INF. Japan could have pursued some kind of broader armament plan, and there is interest in Japan to, I think, pursue those indigenous capabilities over kind of the political nightmare that it might be domestically to have sort of road mobile U.S. missiles kind of conducting patrols and driving around. The survivability point, I think, is very well taken. The only thing that I bring up in response to that is, if we think about the trade-offs and sort of the per unit costs of sort of developing and procuring these new ground-launched cruise missiles, you'd need something that's in a different class than the Tomahawk. I actually did map this out, I think, to hold kind of all targets of interest in China at risk from Guam. You'd need systems in the range of about 3,000 kilometers gets you to the coast, to about Shanghai. And then you need to go up to about 8,000, which takes you into ICBM range anyways. So you're going to need some pretty long-range cruise missile systems, which means this is going to be something altogether new that doesn't really exist right now if we're talking about developing something. The kind of things that you could kind of put together in a quick and dirty form, I think maybe even by the early 2020s, would be something like Mark 41 VLSs on land, kind of the thing that actually Russia worried about in Western Europe, right, with the European phased area approach, missile defense systems. They worried that we could convert them into offensive systems. And yeah, that's actually quite feasible. We just didn't do that. So that could happen.
Can I pause you on that? Can I pause you on that? Because I have a question associated with that. So I noticed that you haven't, and nobody's really talked about what the situation in South Korea, right? Mm-hmm. I know South Korea does not want to mess with China in fashion, and South Korea right now doesn't really want to mess with North Korea. But South Korea, especially because South Korea has accepted ABM systems, what sort of prospect there is there for the stationing of offensive GLICMs?
Well, so the South Koreans have their own indigenous cruise missiles, the Hyunmoos. They haven't been looking for American deployments to deliver a similar capability. And explicitly right now, the way the alliance exists. So this is actually an interesting point because, we should take the Korean Peninsula debate into account. If the alliance with South Korea is sort of fundamentally reconceived, as sort of even some South Korean progressives have been making this point, right? If we have a peace treaty with North Korea, the raison d'etre of the alliance changes from deterring North Korea to being just part of the broader U.S. network in East Asia to deter China and to maintain a regional security architecture. Fine. If that happens under those circumstances, I think South Korea could be a potential basing location. Although, again, I think you would really need a very serious change in the domestic political constraints. Even, in the same conversation where I've had this with kind of left or even center left folks in South Korea about rethinking the alliance, in one breath they'll tell you this, and then the next breath they'll say, well, we're also fundamentally rethinking the role of our relationship with China kind of going forward in the next few decades. So it's hard for me to really imagine South Korea as a candidate. I think Japan, you're a lot more safer in the sort of general domestic political consensus about there being a threat from China. I think in South Korea, it's far more nebulous in my view.
Right. Well, let me also suggest. I'm also going to make, and this is what I would call the sort of the net assessment case, right? The net assessment case for Glickham's, and in fact, this was sort of the central contribution that Glickham's made in competition between the United States and Soviet Union way back when, right? That fundamentally we should be thinking about this not in terms of the specific capabilities that these systems deliver, whether they're stationed on Guam or whether they're stationed on in Japanese islands or even in South Korea. Those ones. We should be thinking about these in terms of the problems that they create for Chinese defense planning, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, in just sort of to drag this back to Guam and to drag this back to question of whether the Chinese can attack these kinds of missiles on Guam. It's certainly possible that they can, and it's certainly possible that they can even hit them. But they have to change their targeting policies, and they have to change the throw weights, even of conventional munitions, that they're willing to hurl at a place like Guam, simply because Glickham's might exist, right? And I think that also is going to be an impact on how China is going to think about its defense policy and think about sort of structuring its own missile forces and its own air and naval forces when there's even the prospect of putting potentially lethal Glickam systems on Japanese islands or on the Philippines or in South Korea, right? You don't actually even need to deploy those systems to have China worried about that someday you might deploy those kinds.
Yeah.
And that changes the way that China does its procurement, changes the way that China does its basing, because they're not necessarily going to rely on Japan's decision not to deploy these systems, because they also understand that Philippine decision makers and South Korean decision makers.
Yeah, I think the procurement challenges and the targeting challenges will arise. I mean, I think, if I sort of game through in my mind a Chinese reaction to a Glickam deployment, let's just say, Guam, because we both agree that that's the most likely, at least initial point of deployment. I mean, I can very easily see the Chinese also, they're augmenting their own damage limitation capabilities, their own homeland missile defense systems for shorter range systems to deal with that problem. One of the more creative proposals that I haven't really seen discussed is something like using the Army's new extended range ATACMS systems based on something like landing helicopter docks, potentially even carriers, mobile at sea. You're using a ground launch system simply at sea on a sea-based platform, which sort of gets you some of the same challenges associated with naval deployments in terms of cost, certainly, but does help sort of bridge that gap. The other thing is, I think one of the more interesting arguments that I've heard from the proponent side is that given the problems with sort of sea-based systems, especially things like the Virginia class and Virginia payload module, the development of those systems and potential delays there, it might be prudent to sort of hedge our bets by looking into a Glickam deployment. I'm not sure that, that necessarily, again, convinces me, because I think I can imagine a lot of problems coming up with the deployment of a Glickam. We also have to be open to the fact that, post midterms, who knows if we even can appropriate funds for a new kind of system like this. But yeah, I mean, a lot of these arguments, I think, really get at the core issue. But Rob, I do want to ask you, sort of zooming out from this conversation, right? So we've just kind of done the thing where we're two Asia hands talking about the nitty gritty of deployments, ranges, procurement, targeting. Zooming out, though, you get back to that problem of the transatlantic relationship, where all of what we just said, I think, will be very unconvincing to Western European allies. And I think that's a consideration that we ought to care about. And I think more Asia hands should be attuned to those considerations. So what is kind of the final point that you'd sort of use to kind of sell this idea of withdrawing?
I mean, I'm going to be kind of glib on this, and
Go for it.
I'm going to be glib because my answer isn't great, because this ship has already sailed. But my response to sort of this notion that, look, the Trump administration did this really, really badly, right? It does everything badly, right? It's just not good at things, and especially diplomatic things. But my answer is that this is an object lesson. The situation with the INF is an object lesson on why you don't needlessly antagonize your allies, right? Why you don't go over there and yell at them continually and talk about how they're free riders and everything else, and don't break agreements with them that you don't need to break, right? You antagonize your allies when you have to antagonize your allies, when it's a good idea to antagonize your allies, but not for what is basically domestic political gain, right? I mean, the Europeans are, I think, rightly going to be agitated by this, right? And it's legitimate for them to be agitated by this. And it would be better if we hadn't been agitating them over the last 2 years about things that they didn't need to be agitated about, right? So this is why alliance maintenance is important, because sometimes you have to do things that your allies aren't really going to be terribly happy about, and it's easier to do those things when the relationship is otherwise healthy, right? So keep that relation in the future. Try to keep those relationships healthy rather than sort of intentionally damage them, because you might have to do something in the future that's going to damage that for other reasons.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, so two small comments on that, and then we'll wrap up the discussion. I mean, one that I've heard from some of the more transatlantic focused analysts in recent days was that the Europeans didn't take the issue of Russian compliance with INF as seriously as they should have, and didn't make enough noise about it. And that's part of the reason that we find ourselves in the circumstances that we find ourselves in today. And, you know, maybe that was something that should have happened in the final years of the Obama administration that could have led to more publicization, more pressure on the Russians to actually have a serious conversation about compliance. So that's one. The second issue relates to, you know, the legacy of the discussion over INF in China, which I think is interesting. And we sort of find the United States and Russia out of phase. In 2007, so Bob Gates talks about this in his memoirs, the Russians threatened to leave INF because they worry about Second Artillery Corps, and they say, look, China's on our doorstep and they have all of these missiles and we can't do anything to counter them because of sort of INF tying our hands, right? And then obviously a few years later, after Crimea and the broader collapse in the relationship, we start seeing the SSC-8 turn into a serious system and deployed in Western Europe. So the question now is, you know, are the Russians sort of also concerned about China? And I think that concern hasn't really evaporated, even though, you know, everybody's been kind of freaking out with things like Vostok 2018. I think those anxieties in Russia are still very much present about China. And the thing is, you know, Trump said yesterday, I mean, again, nothing that Trump says necessarily tells us anything about his true beliefs or his administration's sort of approach to things, but he said that China should be part of INF, right? And that's sort of long time, you know, just been a non-starter, and nobody's taken that seriously. China is nowhere near parity with the United States or Russia when it comes to its nuclear arsenal, so it kind of uses its massive conventional superiority to offset some of those disadvantages, and we don't want to encourage China to pursue a nuclear arms race and come up to parity with the United States. But it's interesting that it took basically 11 years for Russia to make the point that, look, INF is tying our hands with China, and then 11 years later, this is sort of being used as one of the major motivations to finally withdraw from the agreement. So that I just think is an important bit of kind of historical perspective to just keep in mind here. So Rob, you're the guest on the podcast, so I do want to give you the last word in this conversation about INF.
My last word is just going to be a response to your previous. I mean, it doesn't seem to me that the Russians are really all that concerned about the abrogation of INF. They're not that. I don't think they are irritated about the end of INF in the same way that they were irritated about the end of the ABM treaty, right? They would not have treated it so cavalierly if they had really been worried about it, right? But what they have successfully done here is make the United States look like the bad guy for ending a treaty that they were cheating on, and that's really quite well done. But I guess my second last word would be this, that I think the arms control community, and I've made this point on Twitter and other places, the arms control community really needs to break out of its Atlantic and especially its Russia focus. I think that the community has really sort of struggled to think very successfully about the rise of Chinese military power. And in part, that's because that rise has been fundamentally conventional, and the arms control community is laser focused on nuclear issues and has been focused on nuclear issues for a long time. Russia is simply not a major conventional threat to the United States, and China is a major conventional threat to the United States. And so we need to be thinking about arms control in more creative ways than simply defending every treaty that was made in the 1980s because you're worried about the neocons tearing everything down. So we need to rethink how we do arms control and how we defend arms control.
Yeah, well, that's the call. That's a call to arms that I can get behind. I think there
All right.
needs to be more creative thinking about the challenges posed by China. I mean, the conventional challenge posed by China isn't a threat necessarily to the United States. It's a threat to U.S. interests in the Asia Pacific, in the, I guess, Indo-Pacific as we're calling it these days. But
Right.
but I think that's important. It's a serious challenge. And I think the really interesting question, if there's one thing that I took away from this discussion with you, is this discussion about the plasticity of sort of allied and partner preferences and sort of observing how those are going to change with time. I think we're at a very interesting point right now where we are sort of seeing countries, take note of the fact that America first might not mean that they can necessarily, quote unquote, free ride on U.S. security assurances, and maybe maybe we'll start seeing the China challenge push countries like, even partner countries like Vietnam and India to potentially think more creatively about these kinds of issues that we've talked about here today. And yeah, I mean, we'll have to really, there will have to be a hard conversation with many of the allied states if this does go forward and there are GLICM deployments in Asia again. But yeah, I mean, I think that was probably one of the areas that I found most interesting. So, anyways, Rob, thanks a lot for joining me. This was really a fun discussion, and I hope this kind of kicks off a broader debate between the kind of three sets of people I described at the beginning. I think this is something that I would love to see a lot more kind of writing and thinking on too. So, if you've got something else to say, definitely you know where to find me.
All right. Thanks so much, Ankit, for having me.
Absolutely. For our listeners, if you liked what you heard on the podcast and you haven't yet subscribed, make sure you go ahead and do that. And if you have been a subscriber for a while but you haven't left us a review, go ahead and do that as well. It really helps get the word out about the show, and you can do that on either iTunes or Google Play. So thanks a lot for listening, and I'll be back next week with more.